Thank you for tuning in to the MBL Network, and you're watching the MBL Blitz.
Welcome to another episode of the MBL Blitz Podcast. As always, I'm your host, TFA, and today we have our end-of-season award show for you guys. Alongside me today is my co-host, JY. He's been working really hard on these all-rookie teams. Now, JY, this is your third rendition of the all-rookie team, if I remember correctly, correct?
Yeah, this is actually the third annual.
Well, it's getting to be one of our favorite shows. I think we're getting better with these each year. Personally, it's one of my favorite segments. It's always nice to see how these rookies do throughout the season. We go into the draft with so much hype. We do the live draft show. So it's nice to give some of these guys some credit as the year goes on. Let's go ahead. We're going to jump into it here. We're going to start the season 23 all-rookie offensive team. So first, here on the offensive side of the ball, we have quarterbacks. The two selections here are going to be from the New England Patriots. That's going to be Steven Zott. And from the Buffalo Bills, we got Dustin Ely. Over at the running back position, another Bills player, Keyshawn Morton. And then Minnesota Vikings running back, Francis Cornelius. At the wide receiver spot, we've actually got four guys that we want to touch on here. Los Angeles Rams wide receiver, Wesley Britton. New England Patriots wide receiver, Cortez Boger. Baltimore Ravens wide receiver JT Jacoby, and Chicago Bears Lakeem Tompkins. And in the tight end position, we've got Eagles tight end Andre Whitner and New Orleans Saints tight end Leroy Booker. Now, JY, before we hop into the offensive linemen here, I know that we wanted to touch on a few of these guys. First, I want to look at the quarterbacks because I know that you're itching to get talking about these quarterbacks. First thing I noticed is Zott and Ely weren't the number one quarterback taken, and neither were the number two quarterback taken. So what can you tell us about these selections for the quarterback position?
Well, as you said, they weren't the number one quarterback taken, which happened to be Jarrett Ripkowski out of Green Bay. And unfortunately, the reason why Ripkowski ended up at the bottom of the list is that he actually made his team worse. The Packers weren't that bad before they drafted him. They kind of threw all their eggs in one basket, and Ripkowski just couldn't get it done in the win column. The other one was Asher Darby. He really didn't get a lot of wins for the Miami Dolphins either, but the reason why these two quarterbacks slipped out of that position on the all-rookie team is both of them actually ended up getting into some trouble with the league towards the end of the year and got suspended, so therefore their stats got hurt a little bit. And, Zott had a really good year. He found a really good connection with Boger, the wide receiver out there on the outside. And Ely just had a very consistent year. I mean, he wasn't, flashy. He just got the job done.
Yeah, and a nice little correlation. You notice the quarterback position, you've got Steven Zott, and then you look over at the wide receivers, and you've got Cortez Boger, who was, also drafted there in that first round for the Patriots. And then same thing with the Buffalo Bills. You've got Dustin Ely, and then they've also got Keyshawn Morton. So you're talking about, two guys on each of these teams that seem to have played a direct correlation into why these quarterbacks were selected over maybe the number one and number two guys. We could see a correlation just because of the fact that they may have been drafted later, but it looks like they got a lot more help from, the pieces around them. Obviously, Boger really helped Zott in his first year. And Morton was one of the best running backs in all of MBL this year. So do you think that played a direct correlation into why these guys had a little bit of a better season than the number one and number two guys?
Yeah, I think Ripkowski is one of those situations where you can't be the only player on your offense. The Bills and the Patriots both kind of got, a teammate, a pal, a friend where they can learn and grow together, and they just got chemistry going in the preseason, and it just took off.
Yeah, and another thing I wanted to note on here, we had a pretty big snub here, and this was in my eyes and in yours. Halfback Taurease Emmanuel from the Texans. Now, we talked a little bit about this earlier, you and I did. What do you have on Taurease Emmanuel? Why was he kind of snubbed from this list? Because he had a really good year over there in Houston.
Inconsistency. That's the number one thing that his per play average actually was worse than somebody who had less yards, just because, most of the games you look, he barely made it over 40 yards in almost half of his games, and he only had really 3 games where he was over 100 yards and was a factor. His biggest game that he had actually came week 16 against the Browns, where he had 165 yards on the ground. That was his best yardage total. Other than that, you're looking at, here's a game where he had 26. There's another one with 54, 43, 58. He just couldn't get it done on a consistent basis.
Yeah, and I want to touch on that a little bit too. The Texans are my division opponent, and I saw that. Like you said, he had his best game in Week 16. I played the Texans Week 15 and in Week 17. Week 15, he had a real good game. I thought he played a really, really consistent game the whole, all the way throughout. He was making good cuts, breaking a lot of tackles. But then in Week 17, it was a different story. Like you were saying, he struggled a little bit, didn't break as many tackles. So I can understand why he was left out there. Let's head over to the offensive line now. On the offensive line side of the ball, we're going to have left tackle. We have the San Diego Chargers and Matt Sanchez. And then we also have the Detroit Lions with Le'Veon Romeus. Over at left guard, we're going to have the Detroit Lions again, Ray Fasano. And then Arizona Cardinals left guard, Mike John. Center position, we've got Pittsburgh Steelers center, Jose Soriano. And wouldn't you know it, it's another Detroit Lions center, Jarrett Whitfield. At right guard, we're going to have the Seattle Seahawks. Right guard is Rayshon Eckel. And then Minnesota Vikings guard, Kona Ryans. And then to round out the offensive side of the ball, we've got the right tackles, and that's going to be Buffalo Bills Patrick Chase and the Los Angeles Rams Heath Mace. Now, JY, I don't want to spend a ton of time on the offensive line, but one thing I really want to touch on, we've got 3 Detroit Lions here on that offensive line list. So 3 of the 5 offensive line positions, we have a Detroit Lion there. Bomber had a great season this year running the ball. All of a sudden, he found a running game with Bubba Dillon, found out how to run the ball. Do you think that it's because of these new offensive linemen?
Yeah, I don't think, Bomber found a running game. I think he created it. Bomber did something that Bomber I don't think he's ever done before, and that's take offensive linemen for almost all of his first 3 picks and look at where they are. All 3 of them are on this list. They all made a big impact. He had over 1,000-yard rusher. Matt Stafford again, ho-hum, 4,100 yards. It's what Stafford does. But it's the fact that, Bomber has a running game, and it's now because of this super young offensive line that he's put together.
Yeah, he's put together an offensive line that's going to be a dominant force for a while. And that's a little bit, I think that's saying something to the whole league there. If you are having trouble running the ball, maybe think about drafting a couple of offensive linemen. A lot of people are very hesitant to draft offensive linemen early, but clearly Bomber found something, and the Lions, figured something out, and they're having success with it. So maybe, don't focus on other positions if you don't need them. Maybe take some offensive linemen. Let's jump over to the all-defensive rookie team. Season 23, we got the left ends. We're going to start off, we're going to go in 3 tiers here. So defensive line, linebackers, and then secondary. Starting off at the left end, we've got the Tampa Bay Buccaneers' Stephen Warfield, and then the Miami Dolphins' Lewis Best. At the defensive tackle position, we've got San Francisco 49ers' Carlo Dyson and Denver Broncos' Julius Knoll. And then at right end, we've got the Tennessee Titans' Tevin Ragland and the New Orleans Saints' Marquise Brockers. Now, JY, one major thing that we've been talking about right now is how weak this upcoming draft is at the defensive line position. So on these previous rookies, who stands out to you on the defensive line here?
Well, obviously, San Francisco had, 2 defensive tackles that they took. Both of them played really well. Carlo Dyson did, extremely well and ended up on the list. Stephen Warfield, Tampa Bay, which is my team, their defense was on the field almost the entire game, so the guy was going to get his chances of getting sacks and tackles behind the line of scrimmage. Tennessee had a really good standout in Ragland. Other than that, I mean, there wasn't a lot of production, but guys were still contributing.
Yeah, and defensive line is a position that it really seems like you have to get a couple years of experience. It's one of the tougher positions to come in and be an immediate force, in my eyes at least. It's normally the guys that have a couple years experience that are seeming to be the higher sack guys, the bigger playmakers on defense. Heading over to the linebacker side, a lot of linebackers. I thought this was a very good linebacker draft, especially outside linebacker. So we had a lot of guys here, but I think you did a pretty good job narrowing the list down. At left outside linebacker, we've got Houston Texans Zach Sheffield, and we've got the Philadelphia Eagles Renoy Bradshaw. At the middle linebacker spot, we've got the Oakland Raiders Alian Kroom, and the Miami Dolphins Hale Gatson. And then right outside linebacker, we've got the Cardinals Tracy Smallwood and the Atlanta Falcons Oriel Kyle. This list is loaded with big name talent. I mean, all of these guys, did a lot for their teams this year. Sheffield, Kroom, Smallwood, and Kyle specifically really lit it up this year. What do you have to say about the linebacker spot?
Actually, I think you'd be pretty surprised that my favorite player out of this whole list was actually a second-round guy. He was drafted with the 15th pick in the second round. I think he actually had a better season than Kroom did there in the middle. He had 31 tackles, 1 sack, 1 forced fumble. The guy had 5 interceptions, and he ran 1 back for a touchdown. I think his production was a little bit better than Kroom, but he was like my little sleeper pick that as I was putting the stats and compiling the list where I'm fingers crossed, I'm like, just stay on the list, and Kroom never got above him, so...
Yeah, and that's interesting. I didn't really know a whole lot or see a whole lot about Gatson. But I mean, saying that he had a better season than Kroom is pretty impressive. I mean, Kroom had quite the year at the middle linebacker spot. He came into the league and just immediately tore it up, especially for a draft that wasn't that deep on middle linebackers. I think that he really came in and showed something. I think that Tracy Smallwood, though, I was looking at his stats earlier. Tracy Smallwood also had a great season at outside linebacker for the Cardinals. They've really assembled quite the linebacker core over there in Arizona. Switching over to the secondary, we've got the cornerbacks. We've got 4 cornerbacks, much like we had 4 wide receivers. So we've got the New Orleans Saints corner, Latarius Baxter. We've got 2 San Francisco 49er cornerbacks, Svando Clark and Anton Veltung. And then we've got the Indianapolis Colts Connor Mealy. At the free safety spot, we've got the Jacksonville Jaguars Marcos Childress, the Seattle Seahawks Gordon Borrell, and then at strong safety, we've got, hang with me here on this name, Kansas City Chiefs Tavuzal Arnold, I think I said that right, and then Indianapolis Colts Solomon Clifton. So that's going to round out your NFC all-defensive team. A few things to note. I think that a theme here, especially on the defensive side of the ball, got a lot of 49ers. Especially at the cornerback position. Deco really wanted to solidify that defensive side of the ball, and I think it really correlated into him getting some wins. He played a lot better this year. He wasn't at the very bottom of the league, and he got himself some tough wins. Who stands out to you here in the secondary?
Well, I think you're going to like what I have to say here because it's going to be Marcos Childress. I think it was a really good pick for the Jacksonville Jaguars on a team that got decimated through free agency. I think he is going to solidify up the Jacksonville, back half of that defense for a very long time. And the sky's the limit on that kid. I don't think he played up near to the potential he could be in, because when you're, at least in the games where I watched, the guy was just running all over the place. I think once he learns the playbook where he's supposed to be, he's going to find the ball.
Yeah, he was definitely a playmaker for me this year. He definitely did a lot of good things. He was definitely all over the field, like you were saying. I want to point into Anton Veltung, though, for the 49ers. This guy had a great year, but not as great as I think the 49ers expected him to have. I think that Veltong was probably the guy that the 49ers thought would be their number one player this year. I'm not sure that he lived up to number one player status, but I think that this 49ers team has a really good young secondary to build off of here in the upcoming years. I think Deck is doing a great job over there.
Well, Veltong, he did end up with 35 tackles. He had a forced fumble, 1 interception. He did, get a score on defense. I don't think you're going to see a lot of interceptions out of this guy, but you're going to see a lockdown corner who's willing to shed the block and get down there and get his bell rung, stopping the run.
Yeah, I agree. I think you'd see a little bit more in terms of the interception category if they could keep the defense off the field a little bit more. I think he's probably playing a little bit tired a lot of the time. Going for a lot more of the knockdowns and just trying to stay with the coverage as opposed to getting those interceptions. But time will tell. All right, let's switch gears here from the all-rookie team. Joining myself and JY today on the show and appearing on the Blitz for the first time is MBL Chargers owner Mr. Chunky. Chunky, how does it feel to be on the Blitz for the first time?
It feels good. I'm just glad to be on here. I'm glad you guys brought me on, and I can't wait to get my predictions out there.
Yeah, and we're really glad to have you on the show. I know we've been working on getting you on the show here for a couple weeks, grooming you for the show, and I hope to find a niche for you. I want to point out that Chunky will likely be a frequent guest on the Blitz as we look forward to growing our team here. Next up, we're going to have our AFC and NFC player-specific awards. Much like the MVP award, these were chosen by Chunky, so we're not going off of what Madden said. These were chosen directly by Chunky. So if you have any disgruntled complaints, for him, go ahead and send them to him if you think you have a player that got snubbed. So let's go ahead. I'm going to read off here the list for you, Chunky, and then we've got a few questions for you. Season 23 Player of the Year awards. The AFC Offensive Player of the Year and Offensive Rookie of the Year is going to be Bills running back Keyshawn Morton. Morton had 1,180 yards on the ground, 13 touchdowns, and he averaged 6.3 yards per carry. The AFC Defensive Player of the Year is going to be Patriots middle linebacker Su'a Cravens. Cravens had 60 tackles, 9 interceptions, 13 tackles for a loss, and 2 touchdowns. And your AFC Defensive Rookie of the Year is going to be Raiders middle linebacker Alien Kroom. Kroom had 76 tackles, 9 interceptions, 10 tackles for a loss, and 1 touchdown. Now, Chunky, before we get to the NFC, I want to bring you in here. We're going to discuss a few things. What made you decide to go with Morton as not only the AFC Rookie of the Year, but also the AFC Player of the Year? Because that's not something you normally see. You normally don't see a rookie that comes in and is immediately the Offensive Player of the Year for a conference.
Absolutely, and I just thought he had an outstanding year for a rookie, and even that, he had one of the best years for a running back. He was only 25 yards behind the league-leading rusher, Ezekiel Elliott. He was 1 touchdown behind him, and he had less carries. So just to me, that stood out right there. And then obviously, he was head and shoulders above all rookies, and especially rookie running backs, so I just think he had to be the choice there.
Yeah, I agree with you on that. I think you could have made a case for Morton as the most valuable player. You saw a big jump in how this Bills team played. They got a lot better with Morton on the team. I think Morton was definitely the consensus pick for AFC Rookie of the Year, or Player of the Year, sorry. But what about guys like Dak Prescott, Allen Robinson, and Kendall Tompkins? How close were they to getting the AFC Offensive Player of the Year?
And you know what's funny? You say those names because those are actually the other 3 names that I looked at. And what it came down to was that Keyshawn Morton was just so far above the rest of the competition in the AFC that I just had to put him there. Dak Prescott, respectively, had a good year. Kendall Tompkins, the Bengals running back, he was right there as well, but he just didn't have as many yards as Keyshawn Morton. And, Allen Robinson, another great receiver. I just couldn't justify putting any of them above him.
Yeah, I was looking at the stats earlier, and I think the only guy you could have made it a case for is Kendall Tompkins. I think that, their yards were a little bit off. Tompkins had more touchdowns, I believe, than Morton, if I remember correctly, but less yards per carry. So I think you definitely made the good choice there. Now, your AFC Defensive Player of the Year went to Su'a Cravens. What set this guy apart from Houston corner Fanau Evans? I looked at his stats earlier. He'd led the league in interceptions, and he was just a lights-out player this year. What made you go with Cravens instead of Fanau Evans?
And that pick might look a little controversial to some people, but to me, Su'a Cravens was just an outstanding defensive player this year. He had 9 interceptions, which was only 2 behind Finau Evans, who was a cornerback, and being a middle linebacker, you're not going to get as many interceptions. So for him to be only 2 behind, that really stood out to me. He had more tackles than Finau Evans at 60 tackles. He had 13 tackles for loss, and then he had 2 touchdowns, which to me was just great stats for a middle linebacker. And so I had to put him at Defensive Player of the Year.
Yeah, I'm going to completely agree with you on that. I know that Doe was a little disgruntled earlier about not seeing Finau Evans up there as the Defensive Player of the Year. But like you said, Cravens did a little bit more in terms of overall defensive game. He had the interceptions from middle linebacker spot, which means he was playing the pass, but he was also playing the run. Those 13 tackles for loss, 2 touchdowns. This guy was a great playmaker for the Patriots over there. Finally, linebacker Alien Kroom. Now, I know this was a tough one for you. You told me that, both Kroom and Childress were very close. Obviously, I wanted you to go with Childress, but you went with Kroom. What stat was it that made you decide to go with Kroom over Childress for the Rookie of the Year?
And for me, it came down to the tackles for loss and the touchdown factor, where Childress didn't have any touchdowns. Alien Kroom has 1, and Alien Kroom has 10 tackles for loss. They both had 9 interceptions, I believe. I believe Childress was right there too. And they were both pretty close in tackles. And so for me, what it came down to was those 2 stats that I mentioned. And, Alien Kroom was very highly touted coming into the draft. He got drafted by the Raiders there at middle linebacker, and he just performed. He met his expectations, and that really stood out to me as well.
Yeah, I can't disagree with you, but you might be getting a disgruntled message from the Jacksonville Jaguars headquarters for that pick. Heading over to the NFC, we're going to look at the NFC Offensive Player of the Year, and that is none other than Cowboys running back Ezekiel Elliott. Elliott ran for 1,205 yards, 14 touchdowns, and averaged 4.5 yards per carry. The NFC Defensive Player of the Year this year was Cardinals middle linebacker Deon Buchanan. He had 98 tackles, 10 interceptions, and 20 tackles for a loss. Your NFC Offensive Rookie of the Year is going to be Rams wide receiver Wesley Britton. Britton had 1,180 yards receiving, 8 touchdowns, and averaged 15.7 yards per catch. The NFC Defensive Rookie of the Year is going to be Cardinals outside linebacker Tracy Smallwood. He had 65 tackles, 1 interception, 11 tackles for loss, and 6 sacks. Ezekiel Elliott, he won the MVP award, obviously, so it's no surprise to see him where he's at. So I definitely completely agree with you on that pick. Matt Stafford had a down year in terms of statistic purposes. Zeke really carried this Dallas team, though. He had 2 slow seasons, if you want to call them that, in his last 2 years. Do you think that Zeke is back to being one of the best running backs in the NBL?
Oh, I absolutely think so. Ezekiel Elliott, as you can see, 1,205 yards this year, led the league. 14 touchdowns. That's a great number, which is behind Bubba Dillon. I believe Bubba Dillon had 19. And so, but yes, I believe he's back to his old form for these Dallas Cowboys. I think he'll lead them, and I think they can go far. This year they didn't perform to what they were expecting, but I think next year, definitely watch out for those Dallas Cowboys with Ezekiel Elliott.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think if they can get that running game going along with the passing game, they're going to be a real big offensive threat. Another question I have, Deon Buchanan. You look at his stats. This was one of the more impressive statistical years that I've ever seen a defender put up. This, I think, rivals the season, that people like Rush Lunsford had in MBL. He did it all this year. 98 tackles, 10 interceptions, 20 tackles for a loss. Which one of those stats do you think is the more impressive stat to you?
I think for me, it's the 20 tackles for loss. You just look and you can find people that beat him out in tackles. You can find people that beat him out in interceptions. But he was head and shoulders above the rest of the competition as far as tackles for loss goes. 20 tackles for loss, that's just outstanding to me. He almost had 100 tackles, which is a great number to be at. And then 10 interceptions was only 1 behind Finau Evans. So just those stats altogether. Obviously, as you said, great statistical year for Deon Buchanan. Just had to put him at Defensive Player of the Year.
Yeah, I think you could have made a case that this guy could have been the MVP. You're talking about a linebacker who he intercepted 10 passes, which I believe was second in the league. So he was second in the league in interceptions, but he was also covering the run very clearly with 20 tackles for a loss. So if this guy wasn't dropping into coverage, he was getting to the running back, he was getting in the backfield. This guy did it all. I mean, this guy had to have been a playmaker on every play for the Cardinals. Looking at the NFC Offensive Rookie of the Year, guy we talked about a little bit earlier, you mentioned him, Bubba Dillon. We didn't see him on the all-rookie team, and we didn't see him here as the Rookie of the Year. I think if Bubba Dillon had played the full season, I think you could have made a case for it. But, I mean, I don't think you could have gone wrong with Wesley Britton. Do you think he was playing with a chip on his shoulder after seeing there were multiple wide receivers that were taken before him in this past draft?
Absolutely. I believe Wesley Britton knew he wasn't highly expected to do great things coming out of the draft. As you said, multiple wide receivers taken ahead of him. But he came out and he just did his thing, and he put up great numbers this year. And he went for almost 1,200 yards, which would have been a great number for him to be at, 8 touchdowns and 15.7 yards per reception. So for me to not be the first receiver taken in that draft, to put up those kind of numbers is just huge for him. And, a controversy there is, as you said, Bubba Dillon could have been chosen there. But as you said, he didn't play the whole season. Had he, I believe he would have been in there. But like you said, he didn't play the whole season, so I had to go with Wesley Britton there.
Yeah, Britton had a great season. It goes to show that here in the MBL, it doesn't matter who you draft or where you're drafting. You can get a quality guy later on that some of the big guys that get passed on. You can always find quality depth, even though Britton was a first round pick. He was picked, I believe, at the mid to late first round, if I remember correctly. It just goes to show that you don't need to have one of those top overall picks to find a stud. I think Wesley Britton is going to be a really good wide receiver for years to come. Now, in my eyes, there wasn't a standout defensive rookie in the NFC. Smallwood definitely made a big impact alongside Buchanan. Do you think that this Cardinals linebacking core is becoming one of the most legendary forces in the MBL?
And, I believe they have a very good linebacking core. You look at Deion Buchanan, who won NFC Defensive Player of the Year, and you look at Tracy Smallwood, who won Defensive Rookie of the Year. So obviously, Tracy Smallwood, he's only going to get better from here on out. He put up 1 interception, 65 tackles, 11 tackles for loss, and 6 sacks. And, I think those numbers are only going to get better. And I think Deion Buchanan, just there to mentor him, is really going to help him out and help Tracy Smallwood grow into a better player. And so we can definitely expect to see that from here on.
Yeah, you're talking about just between Smallwood and Buchanan, you're talking about 31 combined tackles for a loss. Obviously being on the outside, Smallwood has a better opportunity for some more sacks, and Buchanan's going to have, the opportunity to drop back into coverage a little bit more. But I think this is quite the force that the Cardinals have assembled over there. Now, JY, I know we haven't talked to you in a little bit here. Do you have anything that you want to touch on here with some of our awards for the yearly awards for the AFC and NFC?
Well, just kind of piggybacking off of what you guys were saying about, Smallwood and Buchanan, you can't key on either one of those two players when you go up against Arizona, so that means one of them is going to be coming free every time. If you put them both on the left, there's not enough guys on the left-hand side of the football on offense to block, those two linebackers plus a D tackle and a D end. So it's only a matter of time, and I think as long as they keep that up in Arizona, those tackles for loss are just going to keep growing and growing and growing.
Yeah, I know I definitely wouldn't want to play against this linebacking core 2 times a year. So big shout out to Bob for doing what he's done with those two linebackers, because that's one of the more impressive stats that I've seen. Those two guys side by side is a really, really good force to have. That's going to do it for our award show this year. Chunky, I want to thank you for coming on the show this week. I look forward to having you on here again soon. So thanks for coming on. Do you have anything else you want to say to the viewers or the rest of MBL?
Just expect to see more of me on this show and expect these hot topics my way, and it's not always going to be what you like, but it's going to be what's correct.
Hey, I like that attitude. Be sure to tune in to the Commissioner's Corner podcast. I believe they're going to be putting it on an episode next week as we wrap up the season. And then again, right before the draft is we are going to have Gub and Doughboy on for our annual live draft show. Now, Chunky, I know I haven't talked to you yet, but if you're interested in coming on for our live draft special, the more the merrier. We can always use another arguing hand on the show. You're not going to want to miss it. This is one of our favorite shows to do. If you missed it last year, head over to the MBL Network YouTube page and watch it. because this show is a ton of fun. We had a blast with it last year, and I expect this year to be even better. As always, I'm TFA with my co-host JY, and we are the Blitz.